I was 72 years old, a widow of 3 days, and I had a daughter-in-law about to erase me in front of the entire county. What happened next changed everything. But before I get there, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been so competent for so long that the people around you simply forgot to see you? That is exactly what happened to me. For 48 years, I was the invisible foundation of one of the largest cattle ranches in rural Texas. And on the day I needed respect the most, I was publicly humiliated by my own family, in a courtroom with half the town watching. But what happened afterward, you won't believe it. And I promise I'll get there. The county courthouse smelled of old wood and varnish. The American flag fluttered outside in the hot wind of a Tuesday morning, and half the town was sitting in those hard chairs waiting for the reading of the will of Earl Caldwell, my husband, the largest cattle rancher in the region. I was in the front row, navy blue dress, hands in my lap, contained posture, the same posture as always. The lawyer had barely started when her voice cut through the air. My daughter-in-law stood up. Cream-colored suit, impeccable hair. That smile where you never know if it's kindness or strategy. "Your Honor," she said with the calm of someone who has rehearsed every word, "we hope my mother-in-law understands that she won't be in any condition to manage anything on her own. She has never handled the strategic side of the ranch." The room went quiet, and then she added, almost with tenderness, "With all due respect, she depended on my father-in-law her entire life. 48 years of marriage, decades of early mornings with open spreadsheets and cold coffee by my side. My own father's money used as collateral at a time when the ranch almost disappeared forever. All of that reduced to 2 words, depended on him. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, not with malice, with that sharp small-town curiosity. Will the old woman cry? Will she lose control? Will she sign whatever they bring to her? I didn't cry. I didn't move. I sat and waited. Because I've learned one thing in 72 years of life in Texas. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs time. And the time for that day was almost coming. But before telling you what happened next, and something will happen that left that courtroom in complete silence, I need you to understand who I am, where I came from, and how a quiet woman built, without anyone noticing, the foundation of it all. My name is Dorothy. I was born Dorothy Mae Pruitt, daughter of a West Texas grain farmer who believed in 2 things, honest work and faith in God. My mother died when I was 12. From then on, I took over the kitchen, the care of my 2 younger brothers, and the production records of my father's small property, who wasn't literate enough to do it himself. I learned to read spreadsheets before I learned to dance. I met Earl at an agricultural fair when I was 22. He was 26, hat in hand, and had that way of looking at things as if he were always evaluating their real value. He looked at me the same way, and I let him. We married 8 months later. The Caldwell Ranch was small at that time. 300 acres of dry and stubborn land, enough cattle to pay the bills and little else. The paint peeled in the summer heat. The wind pushed dust through the window cracks no matter how many times I sealed them. But we had routine. And routine in cattle ranching is survival. I woke up at 4:45 every day, coffee on the fire, biscuits in the oven, accounting books open on the kitchen table before the sun rose. While Earl worked in the field and took care of the herd, I took care of the numbers. Feed invoices, equipment payments, property taxes, insurance renewals. When the computers arrived, I already knew the patterns by heart. At church we sat in the third pew on the left, him in ironed jeans and shiny Sunday boots, me in a simple dress, the same worn cover Bible year after year. People shook his hand after the service and said, "Earl, you built something extraordinary." He smiled. I smiled too, and for many years I thought it was enough. But let me tell you what happened in 1998, because that was where everything could have ended, and that was where the real history of the Caldwell Ranch truly began, a story that would only come to light 25 years later in that courtroom full of neighbors. Cattle prices plummeted that fall. We had expanded too fast the previous year, bought 200 head on credit. A supplier miscalculated the delivery cost. The price of feed rose almost 12% in a single season. I remember the bank office as if it were today, the watery coffee, the clock on the wall going tick, 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 the manager pushing papers across the table with that expression of polite regret people use when they've already made a decision but still don't want to say it out loud. We were weeks away from losing half the property. Earl came home that night and stood on the porch, unable to come in. He was like that. When shame arrived, all the strength went away. I understood that about him, but someone needed to act. So it was me. My father had left me an inheritance when he died, an amount I had never touched. It was in a separate account. It was the only thing in the world that was entirely mine, independent of anything that had been built together with Earl. I went to the bank alone. I sat in front of a manager who had half my experience and double my arrogance, and I negotiated every point of that restructuring agreement as if I were negotiating for my children's lives. Because that was exactly what was at stake. I extended the deadlines, I adjusted the rates, I inserted asset protection clauses. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, just firm numbers and the right questions. And guided by the lawyer who accompanied me in that process, a sensible man named Douglas Ferreira who left us years later, we did something that at the time seemed merely bureaucratic, but that would prove to be the most important decision of my whole life. Most of the ranch land was legally transferred to my name as an asset protection measure. If something went very wrong, at least that part could not be taken in a lawsuit against Earl. We didn't make a fuss. We didn't tell anyone. In our community, the man ran the ranch. The woman supported. That's how it looked from the outside, and I let it look like that. What I didn't imagine is that 25 years later, that silent decision from a December afternoon would be revealed in a crowded courtroom in front of the whole town and turn everything upside down. But we haven't reached that point yet, and what happens next will change the way you see this whole story. Stay with me. Before continuing, I ask you a small thing that means a lot to me. Comment here which country or region you are watching me from, and leave your like. That helps a lot to hit the goal of 1,000 subscribers. Each one truly makes a difference. Now let's continue. The following years were for rebuilding. We paid every cent of the debt. We expanded to 1,200 acres. We improved the fencing, the irrigation system, the herd management, all with caution, all calculated. Earl hugged me on the porch that night when we closed the deal at the bank and said one thing I carry to this day. He said, "Dot, you are the part of me that never fails." And I said he needed to sleep. I'm like that. I never learned to receive a compliment with grace. Robert grew up in this rhythm. Seasonality of cattle branding, drought cycles, the smell of wet earth after a rare rain. He was the first in the family to go to university. He left at 18 with a small suitcase, and I was proud in a way that didn't fit in my chest. That was where he met Diane. She was smart, I don't deny that. A degree in business administration, articulate, full of ideas about scale of operations and external capitalization. In the beginning, I liked her. I respect people with ideas. At Sunday dinners, she talked about LLC structures for tax optimization, about leveraging equity, about underutilized assets. I listened, because change isn't always wrong. But I noticed something she never realized I was noticing. She never asked how we had survived the difficult years. She never asked why certain debts had been structured that specific way. She never had curiosity about what was underneath what she saw. She saw what the ranch was, not what had been necessary for it to continue existing. And slowly, without open conflict, she was positioning herself closer to the decisions. When Earl's heart began to fail 2 years ago, everything accelerated. Hospital visits replaced cattle auctions. The medication schedule replaced the feed schedule, and it was in this period that Diane began to show up at financial meetings with Robert. At first, I didn't find it strange. Robert needed support. She had the training. It made sense. But then she brought paperwork to the hospital. "Just a precaution," she said with that calibrated smile. "A power of attorney in case decisions need to be made quickly while Earl is hospitalized." I took the document. I read each page carefully. Operational authority, flexibility of asset transfer, expansion clauses. That would have allowed the entire property to be restructured without my supervision. I returned it without signing. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes this time. After that, more proposals came. Partial sale of equity interest to investors from Dallas. Conversations about modernization with external capital. And I began to feel something I had never felt inside my own home. Not hostility, replacement, and the hardest part. Robert seemed relieved to let her drive those conversations. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me sensitive, that maybe I really was becoming outdated. After all, I was almost 72. I had always been the quiet one. Maybe receding was simply the natural order of things. But there is a difference between receding by choice and being pushed out of your own story. And I only understood that difference completely that morning in the courtroom when she said to the whole town that I had depended on Earl my whole life, and it is now that I need to tell you what happened next. Because what came after that moment changed not only the reading of the will, it changed what this whole town thought they knew about the Caldwell family. Mr. Callahan stood up from the second row, 73 years old, the largest cattle rancher in the neighboring county, Earl's business partner for more than 30 years, a man who didn't waste words. When Jim Callahan asked to speak, the room stopped. He took off his hat before addressing the judge. That simple gesture already said that what came next deserved respect. "With respect, Your Honor," he said with a calm and grave voice, "the woman they are talking about saved this ranch 25 years ago." The room became motionless. Robert turned to him. Confused, Diane held her breath. Jim Callahan described the bank, the meeting, the restructuring, the money that was mine and that I put as collateral, the negotiations that I conducted alone while Earl stayed at home, unable to come in through the door. No exaggeration, just the truth, told by someone who was close enough to know. And then the lawyer opened a second folder. Attached to the will, he said, are the original restructuring documents and the subsequent property transfers. Papers were turned, legal descriptions of land read aloud, parcel numbers, dates, signatures. The majority of the ranch lands, more than 60%, had been legally registered in my name for 25 years, and it had remained that way since then. The lawyer continued. The fiduciary agreement that Earl and I had updated in 2001 included a clause that guaranteed me lifetime operational control over all assets registered in my name, which meant something very simple. Nothing could be sold, leveraged, or restructured without my signature, not by power of attorney, direct, mine. Robert's face lost color. Diane didn't say anything, but it hadn't finished yet. It also came to light, the lawyer said carefully, that preliminary memoranda of understanding were signed earlier this year with external investors. A murmur ran through the room. Those agreements proposed partial sale of equity interest in exchange for expansion capital, but they were contingent on the authorization of the majority owner, authorization that had never been granted because I had never signed anything. I saw Robert's shoulders sink. He hadn't wanted to betray me. I could see that in his face. He believed he was acting in the best interest of the ranch, but he acted without understanding who was legally at the center of everything, and that hurt more than anything said in public that day. The judge requested copies of the draft power of attorney presented during Earl's hospitalization. It was in our files. There it was in black and white. Flexibility clauses for transfer, temporary decision authority extended to structural changes, everything dependent on my signature, which I had withheld. The tension in the room was no longer about whether I could manage alone. It was about who had miscalculated their own authority. Diane spoke again, with that careful composure she never lost. There must be some misunderstanding. Our intention was modernization, not displacement. And I believed that she believed that. But intention doesn't erase presumption. The documents continued speaking for themselves. Tax returns listed me as the primary landholder. Bank records showed my signature on each important restructuring of the last 25 years. Insurance policies carried my authorization. It wasn't dramatic, it was methodical, and with each page turned, the image of a fragile widow was disappearing from that room. What emerged in its place was something no one there expected. A woman who had never stopped managing. A woman who had simply let others speak louder. When we left the courtroom, the Texas sun seemed harsher than usual. Neighbors looked away, not out of judgment, but because of that specific discomfort of someone who realizes they were wrong about someone for a long time and doesn't know how to say it. Robert walked by my side in silence. Diane kept her composure, but the step was faster than normal. Until the end of the day, the news had run through 3 counties. But the real escalation wasn't public, it was internal, because that night I had to face something much heavier than any paperwork. I had to face the possibility that my own son really believed I was incapable, and that cut deeper than any legal dispute could ever cut. That night the ranch felt strange, the same porch, the same huge Texas sky opening up purple and orange over the pastures, the same wind rolling dust along the fences. But the house was quiet in a way it had never been before. For 48 years there was always the sound of boots on the floorboards, Earl clearing his throat, the low murmur of the news coming from the living room. Now there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the wood settling. I sat in my usual chair and finally allowed myself to feel, not the victory, the loss. I didn't cry in the courtroom. I didn't cry when the documents were read. But there, alone on that porch, with the hot wind and the Texas stars that were always too big to seem real, I cried for my son. At some point along the way, I had become the background in the story of my own family. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Had I confused invisibility with humility? I always believed that serving in silence was virtue, that supporting Earl without needing recognition was strength, that letting the next generation lead was wisdom. But there is a line between stepping back with wisdom and being erased little by little, and I had let that line stay blurred for too long. The wind picked up, brushing the porch railing. The cattle moved there in the pasture. Life on the ranch doesn't pause for emotional clarity. I lowered my head and prayed the only way I know, simple and honest. Lord, don't let me react with pride, but also don't let me shrink with fear. I didn't ask for victory. I asked for steadfastness, because I realized something important that night. Allowing disrespect is not a Christian virtue. Silence, when misunderstood, can turn into permission. This was my rock bottom, not for fear of losing land, but because I understood that I had unintentionally trained everyone around me to underestimate me, and that was partly my responsibility. So I made a decision. It wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional, it was strategic. The next morning before breakfast, I called an independent lawyer in the neighboring county. Not the office our family had used for decades. I needed distance, someone who didn't have a history with either side. Her name was Clara. She wore a gray suit and looked me in the eyes when she spoke. That detail seemed small. It wasn't. By the end of that week, I had formally revoked all pending negotiations with external investors, notified the Dallas group in writing that no discussion of equity interest was authorized, requested a full audit of all proposed restructuring drafts. I didn't accuse Robert. I didn't confront Diane with anger. Instead, I invited them to a meeting at the kitchen table, the same table where I had balanced accounting books for 40 years. I put the updated legal summary in front of them with calmness. I am not stepping away, I said, but I am also not giving up anything that is mine. I offered Robert a defined operational role, salary, transparency, a structured path for future inheritance with clearly written terms, without ambiguity, without presumptions. Diane was welcome to present modernization proposals, in writing, reviewed by specialized financial consultants, not informal Sunday dinner suggestions, not hospital hallway paperwork, structure, limits, clarity. There were long silences at that table, disappointment, embarrassment, but no shouting, because maturity doesn't need volume. I didn't remove them from the ranch. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't expose anyone publicly. I simply stepped once and for all into the place that legally had always been mine, and something inside me settled into a place that had been empty for a long time. The consequences arrived without noise. In 2 weeks, the group of investors from Dallas formally withdrew their interest. Without guaranteed majority control, the ranch no longer served their expansion model. They were polite. Strategic misalignment, they said. In town, the tone changed. At first, people whispered about family tension. But when the legal structure became clear, when it was understood that I had been the majority owner for decades, the whisper changed the subject. Diane's reputation suffered the shock she herself had built, not because I said something, because the facts said it. Robert came to the porch alone one night, about 3 weeks after the courtroom. "I didn't know," he said. "They were 3 words, but I heard everything that was behind them." "I know," I answered. He had grown up seeing his father as the visible figure of the ranch. I had allowed that image to stay intact. It wasn't dishonesty, it was tradition. But tradition without clarity distorts memory with time. "I never wanted to replace you," he said. "I know that too," I said. "But leadership is not inherited by assumption. It is received with understanding." We didn't solve everything in that conversation, but respect began to rebuild that night, and sometimes that's what one starts with. Inside the ranch operations, changes were settling into the right place. We adopted selected technological improvements, better herd tracking software, more accurate forecasting tools, but without external capital. Growth slowed down a bit, stability increased. Margins became predictable again. I began to attend the meetings of the county's Rural Producers Association in my own name. Not as the widow of Earl Caldwell, as Dorothy Caldwell, owner. The first time I introduced myself that way, my voice sounded strange to myself, but it didn't shake. With time, something unexpected happened. Young farmers from the region began to look for me, sons of small families who wanted to understand how to negotiate with the bank in times of crisis, how to protect land from excess leverage, how to survive a drought without losing what was built in decades. So I created a simple program, quarterly meetings with young producers through our church and the county's agricultural extension office. Nothing elaborate, spreadsheets, coffee, honesty, and slowly the identity that I had kept for decades began to appear in the light of day. Not with noise, not with display, just visible. 1 year after that morning in the courtroom, I was back on that porch at sunrise. The grass was high after a good spring. The fences we installed 20 years ago were still firm, the herd moving slowly through the pastures that almost slipped from our hands decades before. And I realized something simple and firm. I was never a weight in this story. I was its protection. For years I believed that faith meant staying quiet behind strength, that supporting without appearing was the right role. Now I understand something deeper. Faith is not disappearance. Faith is discernment. It is knowing when to yield and when to stand up. Being silent never made me weak, but learning when to speak made me whole. Let me ask you one thing before I go. Have you ever allowed someone to make you smaller than you really are? Have you already shrunk so that another person could feel larger? If so, what would change if you simply stood up in what you built? Comment down here. I want to hear where you are watching me from and what this story stirred in you. And if this account reminded you that dignity has no expiration date, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the strongest pillar of the house is exactly the one that no one notices until the whole roof depends on it.